Welcome, everyone. Looks like people are still filing in from the waiting room. Still connecting to audio. Please come in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good to see those of you whom I can see. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to come on in, and we will get going. All right. Well, hello, and welcome to the first Friday lecture for the month of March 2025. Our speaker today is basic program instructor Richard Hoskins. Richard's lecture is entitled Nietzsche, Nihilism, and the Death of God. This first Friday lecture is supported by the Anastoplo Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastoplo. My name is Noah Shafitz, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows the lecture, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for Richard in the chat box at any time during the event. Richard will have a chance to respond to your questions after his lecture. During the lecture, Richard and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds. You may choose to leave your video on or turn it off. Richard's video will be spotlighted, so the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view in Zoom instead of gallery view. Before I give Richard a full introduction, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming across the liberal arts, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the basic program has provided our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum dedicated to direct engagement with original texts. At the heart of the basic program is our 4-year core sequence, which offers firsthand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners and in courses led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Registration for the spring and summer quarters is ongoing, and our sections have a tendency to fill up quickly. So if you haven't already, I recommend that you reserve your spots as soon as you can. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on April 4th, first Friday in April. Our speaker then will be basic program instructor David Shiner, and the title of his lecture is taken from its subject, Max Weber's classic book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Today's speaker, Richard Hoskins, holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and a JD from Northwestern University, where he teaches in the law school and has been awarded the law school's highest teaching award. Richard is also a practicing lawyer with a Chicago law firm and a former assistant United States attorney in the Department of Justice, Southern District of New York. Richard has published articles in academic journals and taught at the University of Virginia Law School. His doctoral dissertation explored the relationship between the political thought of Reinhold Niebuhr and the schools of international relations theory, which is also the subject of a chapter he's contributed to the Oxford Handbook of Reinhold Niebuhr. His primary interests are in political philosophy and theology, U.S. political and legal history, and European religious and social thought. All right, that is it for my introduction. I'm going to hand things over to Richard. Take it away, Richard.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I can be heard okay? Good. Thank you. And thank you all for your interest and welcome to this talk. I'm going to be reading from an old-fashioned paper manuscript. It's the first time in a presentation or a lecture that I've ever read from a manuscript, but I think it's a good idea because I know myself and I've got a lot I want to put in the next 50 minutes or so. And if I don't stick to the script, I'll run out of time and I don't want to do that. So I'll be doing that. Also, I've got a bit of a scratchy throat today, so it may be that from time to time I'll have to mute myself for a cough, and I apologize for that. But here we go. So, Nietzsche, nihilism, and the death of God. What are my purposes? I have three of them. First, to provide a way into the somewhat difficult body of Nietzsche's writing, in case you might find him fascinating or interesting, as I certainly do. He's not an easy read, and he's not a systematic writer, but he's a stimulating thinking partner, always. And so he's worth the effort, I think. Second, to clarify and reverse certain false understandings of Nietzsche's thought, prominent among which are A, that he was a nihilist, which he wasn't, as I'll explain, and B, that he was an immoralist who doesn't care about values or think they have any meaning, which he also was not. Third, I've not come to praise Nietzsche, but only to understand him, which is a big enough job. Much of what he thought and wrote is wrong, and in some cases empirically provably wrong, and it's not always easy to separate the wheat from the chaff. But there's so much insight and much gold in that chaff, and part of what I want to convey is a sense of how to get at that and why I've experienced him that way. So I'll divide my remarks into 4 questions and efforts to address those 4 questions. Number 1, and briefly, who was Nietzsche? Number 2, and this will probably be my largest topic, what is nihilism? Was Nietzsche a nihilist? And how does nihilism fit into his critique of morality in the wake of his proclamation of God's death? Third, looking at the constructive side of Nietzsche's thought, what were his positive contributions to moral principles in the wake of God's death? And fourth, and finally, what are some of the legacies of Nietzsche's thought today? All right. I'm going to begin by giving you 2 important and somewhat famous quotations from Nietzsche himself, which will set the stage for everything I'm going to say. So let me share my screen with you. Here we go. I trust that's visible to everyone. Is that visible, Noah? Okay, good. The first is from The Gay Science, which Nietzsche wrote in 1882. This is section 125 of The Gay Science. Have you not heard of that bad man who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he caused considerable laughter. Have you lost him then? Said one. Did he lose his way like a child? Said another. Or is he hiding? Is he scared of us? Did he immigrate? They shouted and laughed in this manner. The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his look. Where has God gone? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We're all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Where are we moving now? Away from all suns? Aren't we perpetually falling? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any way up or down left? Aren't we straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Hasn't it become colder? Isn't more and more night coming on all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's putrefaction? Gods do decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? That which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? With what water could we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Isn't the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? There's never been a greater deed, and whoever shall be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he shall be part of a higher history than all the history that came before. Here the madman fell silent and again regarded his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it shattered and went out. "I have come too soon," said Death. "My time hasn't come yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still traveling. It's not yet reached human ears. Lightning and thunder need time. Deeds need time after they've been done, before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars. And yet we have done it ourselves." And a second reading from the Nachlass, the notebooks, which were published as the Will to Power, 1888. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we've had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of the great values and ideals. All right, who was Friedrich Nietzsche? Friedrich Nietzsche. He was born in 1844 in Saxony, the son and grandson of German Lutheran pastors. Although most famous for his philosophical and psychological insight, he was formally trained in neither. His doctorate was in philology. His brilliance was recognized when he was named to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24, before even completing his doctorate. Before coming to Basel, Nietzsche had renounced his Prussian citizenship, foretaste of his later assaults on the German state and on anti-Semitism. Nonetheless, he served in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, as a medical orderly. Nietzsche left Basel and the professoriate in 1879 and spent the rest of his productive years, 1879 to 89, on a pension from the university and support from his friends. He spent that last 10 years furiously writing and thinking, mostly in Italy and in the summer in the mountains of Switzerland. Most of the books for which he would become known were written during this 10-year period. He was stricken with a form of insanity at age 45 in 1889, which was the end of his productive life. He died in 1900. I'm not a Nietzsche scholar. There are those who spent their entire academic career studying and thinking and seeking to interpret Nietzsche's words. I'm not one of those, though I've read them. What I am is a serious student of Nietzsche and of those scholarly debates, learning from them and adding my own reactions and thoughts. These are what I bring to you. Why am I so fascinated by Nietzsche, especially when I disagree with much of what he writes? I'm not entirely sure, but I have 3 partial answers. First, the way he writes, even in translation, is captivating and provocative. There's an intimacy about it. It makes it seem almost as if you're in conversation with him at times. This conversational intimacy, in my experience, has rarely been matched since St. Augustine's Confessions. Second, like others in my generation, I was influenced as a young man by existentialism, which was my original entry point into Nietzsche's thought, since he, along with Kierkegaard, was the main modern source. I'll say more of existentialism later. Third, and most importantly, Nietzsche is plausibly the single most important philosophical thinker of the 19th century in terms of his influence on 20th and 21st century philosophical and literary thought. Nietzsche has always been famous for the boldness of his proclamation that God is dead, even though he wasn't the first to say it. But I was moved several years ago when I realized in reading Nietzsche again, including the passage I just read to you from The Gay Science, that when he said God is dead and we have killed him, and when he further said that the result of that death would be centuries of moral nihilism in Europe and the West, I realized that when he said that, Nietzsche saw it as a genuine catastrophe in the human condition and in the human need, which was very much Nietzsche's need, to avoid nihilism and find meaning in life. It was tragic for him, the death of God, yet necessary, he contended. And in the face of this realization, we find Nietzsche the ultimate optimist. The nihilism he foresaw was not, he thought, to last forever, or at least it need not. It was the stage, he thought, to a healthier set of moral norms. Nietzsche was enamored, excited by revisiting, revising, transforming, transvaluing all values now that God is no longer underwriting them. This was his great project, and he thought the great project of all European and Western philosophy going forward. In this ultimate optimism, Nietzsche was perhaps more deeply influenced by the Enlightenment's faith in progress than he would have liked to admit. But at the same time as his optimism, Nietzsche acknowledged that for many, and not just for the herd, but for many thoughtful people as well, the result of this collapse of foundations would be a period where values themselves would seem to be reduced to nothing more than individual or tribal or class-based taste, preference, or, worse yet, an instrument for personal gain and power over others. Because as Nietzsche saw it, humans have lost the divine ground of all being and all values because they realize the stark fact that we're alone under empty skies in an indifferent universe. Because of all this, we must take heart and take on the awesome responsibility of creating new values ourselves for living and for living together without God. This was good news for Nietzsche, but as he realized, it would take a long while for the rest of the world to catch up to his optimistic vision. This is the meaning of the phrase, "I have come too soon," uttered both by Zarathustra and the unnamed madman in the passage I just read from The Gay Science. And in that interim of time, 2 centuries or more, nihilism would be ever present. Which brings us to nihilism. Some believe that we're now living through the long age of Nietzsche's predicted ethical nihilism. Nietzsche scholar Daniel Brazil has called Nietzsche's analysis of nihilism, quote, arguably the most important achievement of his final years, including his understanding of the failure of secular humanists to recognize the intimate connection between their own progressive liberalism and the underlying religious standards they've rejected, as well as their failure to anticipate the dire and inexorable consequences for their ideals of their withdrawal of faith in these standards. Nietzsche saw lingering shadows of the old Judeo-Christian morality, which is the chief object of his attack, in such ideas as equality and human rights, which are grounded in the Christian values of compassion, equality before God, and justice, values now robbed of their metaphysical warrant. They must therefore be re-evaluated, transvalued, and at least presumptively thrown over, Nietzsche thought, as we seek a new, godless, non-metaphysical, non-divine framework for determining human values. This is Nietzsche's great project of the transvaluation of all values. But as I mentioned, Nietzsche was not despondent about all of this. He found it liberating and hoped that eventually so would everyone else, or at least so would the Übermenschen, the plural of the German term Übermensch, U-B-E-R-M-E-N-S-C-H, if you're not familiar with it, often inadequately translated as the overman or superman. A better understanding of what is meant by Übermenschen. Übermenschen is something like the higher order of men or the superior mortals, the best and brightest. I'll have more to say about that later. What's meant by nihilism? Nihilism is a protean term used more often to denounce than to describe anything, used in so many ways as sometimes to be almost devoid of meaning. But we can be more specific in asking the question what Nietzsche meant, what Nietzsche meant, and whether he was a nihilist. Nihilism derives from the Latin nihil, N-I-H-I-L, meaning nothing. So the core of the meaning of nihilism is nothingness. Generally, what people mean when they describe the nothingness of something is that it lacks meaning or content or purpose. Now, without purporting to cover all the meanings of nihilism, I will focus on 3 major ones, which are most important in studying Nietzsche. Namely, epistemic nihilism, or nihilism about knowledge, what we know. 2, ethical nihilism, or nihilism about moral values. And 3, existential nihilism, the sense that life itself is meaningless and without purpose. So, epistemic nihilism, or nihilism about knowledge. This asks, is there any objective meaning to the concepts of truth or reality? Or do we really know what's true or real? The radical nihilist would say no. Knowledge is purely a subjective projection of one's wishes or fears or desires. That's not Nietzsche. To be sure, Nietzsche believes that there are no metaphysical, eternal, universal, or unconditional truths, and certainly no God-given ones. On the other hand, despite his perspectivism, he believes that humans have the capacity to grasp a genuine understanding of reality. Indeed, he believes the pursuit of the truths or the factuality of that reality is not only attainable, but a worthy human good. Second is moral or value nihilism, which asks, do moral values have any objective basis? Or, as the radical nihilist would say, hang on, I'm going to clear my throat. As the radical nihilist would say, are they merely subjective preferences, like taste or cynically motivated means to power? Nietzsche's view is not that of the radical nihilist. He did, however, believe the following things about values. First, or supernatural or metaphysical basis for human values or anything else, because God and all. Second, our inherited Western values come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. They reflect slave morality. This is his argument in the Genealogy of Morals. And they must be completely revalued and transvalued now that the divine basis of that tradition is gone. And third, but on the other hand, and this is the bottom line, moral values, meaning a shared sense of what is most fundamental for the health and flourishing of the individual and society, these are important, and it's possible and desirable, he thought, for are. They will not be universally applicable in his view, but they do have real meaning and substance for those agreeing and adhering to them. So that's value nihilism. Third is existential nihilism. Does life itself have any meaning in the aftermath of God's death, or is existence absurd, hollow? Aside from the mindless instinct for survival felt by all living creatures, is there any reason for living? Kohelet, in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible, describes life as futility and like the pursuit of wind. Arthur Schopenhauer, whose writings were the single most important influence on Nietzsche's own thought, expresses his nihilism in words echoing the chorus in Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus, namely, the finest of all possibilities would be never to be born. The next best, having been born, is to return to death as quickly as possible. Schopenhauer was not an optimist. But this is not Nietzsche, even though Schopenhauer was Nietzsche's starting point, especially Schopenhauer's emphasis on the will, which Schopenhauer believed was the drive that keeps one living despite the meaningless suffering which fills every life. Nietzsche adopted Schopenhauer's notion of willful drives determining human conduct, but he disagreed with Schopenhauer's judgment that suffering is the great evil of human existence. In the third essay of the Genealogy, Nietzsche says, quote, man does not repudiate suffering as such. He may even seek it out, provided he's shown a meaning for it, a purpose of his suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind, end quote. In another place, Nietzsche said, to live is to suffer, to survive is to find something worth suffering for. Nietzsche was, by his own description, more a psychologist than a philosopher, just and never formally trained in either field, but his greatest contributions were in the former, the psychology of subjectivity, a field he shared with Kierkegaard, and ultimately with Augustine. Compare the opening words of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. Quote, We are unknown to ourselves. We remain strange to ourselves, close quote. With those of Augustine in the Confessions, Book 10. Quote, men gaze in astonishment at high mountains, broad rivers, the ocean that encircles the world, the stars in their courses, but they pay no attention to themselves, end quote. Nietzsche remarked that all the systems of philosophers are just so many forms of personal confession. In his work, he raised many of the themes later developed by Freud. He probed the human phenomenon of resentment with a power equaled only by Dostoevsky. He adopted Schopenhauer's notion of the will, as I mentioned, and of unconscious drives as the essential springs of human conduct, but firmly rejected Schopenhauer's existential pessimism and nihilism. Nietzsche was, by nature and temperament, something of an ultimate optimist, even a utopian, who believed that humans were capable not only of transforming traditional moral values into something more healthy and human, but also of finding life itself to be meaningful, in part through the activity of re-examining and transvaluing all values. A joyful task to him, now made possible by the death of God. This faith of Nietzsche's, and I think it can only be described as faith, was the basis for another, that of the eternal return or eternal recurrence, about which I'll say more in a moment. To nail down Nietzsche's optimism and his anti-nihilism, let me quote him in the Genealogy, where he says, quote, the Mensch of the future who must come one day will be at once antichrist and anti-nihilist, end quote. He describes the wise person as, quote, a creative spirit of compelling strength sufficient to restore man's goal to the earth and hope to man, one who will redeem us from the great nausea, the great nothingness, from nihilism itself. Though this will take time, during which humans will remain mired in the chaos of abandoning one set of values without yet having a transfigured morality to take their place. It's not just that Nietzsche says he's an anti-nihilist. His life confirms it. If we look at his great project of the revaluation or transformation of all values, he's talking about transforming, not discarding moral values. He doesn't reject the idea of right and true values by which humans should live, just that the Judeo-Christian heritage, which up to now has provided those values, must be discarded. Now, I suggest that a person who, while chronically ill and in pain, searching for better health all over Europe, nonetheless devotes much of his productive life to writing about what should be the moral telos or fate or goal of European civilization, such a person is not an epistemic nihilist, a nihilist of values. Nor can such a person, working frenetically in the solitary, single-minded pursuit of this project, be accused of believing there's no purpose to life, no reason to live beyond the animal drive to survive. And therefore, Nietzsche cannot be called an existential nihilist. A metaphysical nihilist, yes, he was dead, and there's nothing beyond the natural world on which to build value and meaning. But an existential nihilist, finding the natural world to be pointless and empty, that he was not. Now, let me sum up and change topics slightly. Nietzsche is justly famous, as I've noted, both for his critique of the values of Europe and of Western civilization, and also for the optimism with which he believes that all inherited values can be replaced with something better, healthier, following a period of confusion and nihilism. So what about the constructive side of Nietzsche's moral thought? Here, it's very hard to identify in Nietzsche specifically how he thought we should go about the revaluation of values, and hard to identify which values might come out of this grand transfiguration. There are, though, some general indicators, which I'll summarize briefly and then suggest some more specific outcomes. First, Nietzsche always retained a love for the ancient Greeks, in whose language and traditions he was so deeply learned. He particularly liked what he construed as the Greek, the masterful, the strong, both in battle and in civic life. He contrasted this with the Judeo-Christian tradition, which he saw as having been taken over by the weak and powerless, resentful but cunning, which resulted in a set of values, compassion, love of neighbor, humility, which he detested. Second is the will to power, a concept with roots long preceding the time of Nietzsche. Despite the catchiness of the thought in the phrase, it remained underdeveloped by Nietzsche, unfortunately, thus opening the way for later interpreters to fill the void with lethal notions of conflict, conquest, and Kampf. Nietzsche was, as usual, eloquent in expressing the concept, but not as helpful in illuminating it. This much at least seems apparent. Will to power, as he conceived it, exists on a spectrum. Coercive domination, what Augustine called libido dominandi, was at one end, and this is where Nietzsche often put it, and where the Nazis took it up, as I'll come back to in a moment. Nietzsche says in the Nachlass, quote, "And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying, the mystery world of the twofold voluptuous delight, my beyond good and evil. Do you want a name for this world? This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves also are this will to power, and nothing besides." Close quote. But on the other, more gentle end of the spectrum, also consistent with Nietzsche, is what one ancient writer described as, quote, "the wish to be feared or loved for no reason other than the joy of such power of being loved or feared." That, obviously, depending on degree, is a much less threatening concept of power. That suggests we think of will to power not so much in the case of individuals, but in the evolution of social and cultural forces in the last half millennium. According to this view, will to power is the watchword of all of Western history and development since the close of the Middle Ages. We celebrate the dynamism of modern economies and of capitalist development, the conquest of nature through science, the control of nature by humans through technology, and now increasingly of technology over humans, the rise of unprecedented military power and of nearly constant international conflict, the growth and concentration of political power in our own time and even in our own country. So these concepts of will to power, obviously, despite some exaggeration by Nietzsche, still have a great deal to teach us. Third, his notion of the eternal return or recurrence that I briefly referred to earlier. This is a strange notion that affirmation of life in its fullness requires that we love it so much that we would will the eternal repetition of our own lives, just as they've occurred over and over again. The English philosopher Philippa Foot interprets it this way, quote, "One has to remember that Nietzsche wanted to be an affirmer, not a caviller, who repeatedly praised lightness of spirit and wrote much about dancing and laughter. When he put forward this strange theory of the eternal recurrence of all things, this was most significantly a rejection of gloomy nihilism and a way of saying yes, even to his own physically painful and painfully lonely life." End quote. Fourth, of the sort of general constructive contributions that Nietzsche provides for his thought, Nietzsche had a cleavage in his ethics. He believed that there should be different rules for the Übermensch, the superior mortals, versus the herd. He was opposed to the traditions universal, the Judeo-Christian traditions universalization principle, that the same rules and values should apply to everyone. This reflected, he thought, the misguided Christian values of compassion and equality before God. His approach elevated the Übermenschen so high that they were basically unbound by conventional moral limits. Now, not surprisingly, this idea has been greedily taken up by powerful modern figures who fall way short of Nietzsche's definition of superior mortals, but who, nonetheless, love unconstrained power. Nietzsche was resigned to the fact that the herd, being weaker and less talented, would probably hang on to the old values for a long time, which, after all, favored them. Now, out of this general background of transvalued values, the four general points that I just made, is it possible to be more specific about what Nietzsche saw as new values after the death of God? Yes, somewhat. In place of compassion and equality, Nietzsche favors the dominance of the strong over the weak, the talented and gifted over the drudges that comprise most of us, and believe that the moral purpose of society should not be the welfare of all, but rather identifying and honoring the Übermenschen. These, the noble, the gifted, the most creative, these deserve our praise and deference because of their superior gifts and consequently their independence from traditional morality. Sometimes Nietzsche's Übermenschen appears to be quite a restricted elite. He gives only three examples: Beethoven, Goethe, and of course himself. At other times, he implies that there are or will be others, but always an elite comprising the most creative, artistic, and self-directed, ever the herd of ordinary men. Now, most of us are morally repulsed by these proposed values. Nietzsche might say that's because we're still living under the shadow of 3 millennia of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we haven't yet recognized the full implications of the death of God. He might say that, but he would be wrong. First, our present values are not solely attributable to our heritage from Judaism and Christianity. Justice, dismissed by Nietzsche as the result of slave morality, was advocated and written about by Plato and Aristotle, neither of whom read the Hebrew Bible, and both of whom preceded Christianity. Compassion is found in Homer and in Virgil, sometimes even compassion for one's enemy. Recall Achilles in Book 24 of the Iliad returning Hector's body for burial to Hector's father, or the moving speech that Aeneas made to the young warrior whom he had just slain in Book 10 of the Aeneid. And Hammurabi's code, promulgated in Babylonia about 1750 BCE, the king states in the prologue that he was granted his rule, quote, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, end quote. Even the 6th century BC laws of Solon of Nietzsche's beloved Athens freed debt slaves, reduced the power of the aristocracy, and overturned an early form of serfdom. Christianity's central role in the virtue of compassion, it was not invented by or unheard of before ancient Israel or the rise of Christianity. Indeed, many of our moral norms are shared by many peoples and cultures that never believed in the Judeo-Christian God, either dead or alive, and who don't know the Bible or consider it the holy book. And there's another problem. Why does this great project of transvaluation of all values necessarily involve throwing out all past values for the preceding 2 millennia as if there's nothing worthwhile in them? Now, this is clearly what Nietzsche intends, at least sometimes. In the gay science, for example, he says that because, quote, the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, everything that was built upon this faith, propped up by it, grown into it, including the whole of our European morality, is destined for collapse, end quote. Ordinarily, when old ideas are being replaced by new ones, one's method is to critically examine the received wisdom and determine which are no longer useful or have not stood the test of experience or logic and discard them, but also to ascertain which other values have stood the test. And these are retained, though perhaps in revised form. In other words, we don't assume that everything that's gone before is worthless, but that's more or less what Nietzsche proposes. Everything has to go, he says, because all these civilizational, cultural values are the result of slave morality or herd morality based in the Hebrew Bible and the teachings of Jesus. Moreover, Nietzsche believes that all the wisdom we need to construct completely new values we possess today, independent of whatever wisdom might have been reflected in the old values. Thus, we're free and equipped to begin afresh with a blank sheet of paper. Aside from the breathtaking arrogance of that claim, there's still another problem. Had Nietzsche read his fellow German thinker Ludwig Feuerbach and his influential book, The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841? Yes, we know he had. So he knew that Feuerbach also rejected the idea of God, thought that many sophisticated Europeans had done so as well. Yet European culture still maintained those same core values from that tradition. Why had that happened? Feuerbach's answer was that God all along was merely the imaginary celestial screen onto which humans had projected their own ideals, their own values. Those were always human created values, according to Feuerbach. God was only brought in to give them greater force and weight. Now, if Feuerbach is right, it would follow that those human created moral values were projected onto God by humans because those human projectors judged them to be good and useful in some way. They weren't under the spell of slave morality any more than Plato and Aristotle, or Homer and Virgil were. Theology is anthropology, said Feuerbach. Religion is merely an epiphenomenon. Man is the value creator, not God. Well, this thesis obviously turns upside down Nietzsche's idea of where values come from. According to Feuerbach, they come from us, not just the slaves, but from sophisticated modern Europeans as well. By the way, and as an aside, Nietzsche was not entirely hostile to Christianity. He spoke approvingly of the fact that Christianity had brought comfort to many lives. He admired Christianity's historic quest for truth. Indeed, Nietzsche argued that it was Christianity's commitment to truth that ended up undermining its core belief in the existence of God, as it became clear that the evidence was not there. He attributed to Christianity the source of the Enlightenment, which Nietzsche did not admire, and the scientific revolution, which he did. Note, however, that for all his railing against Christian thinkers and the Judeo-Christian tradition, Nietzsche shared its search for a meaningful existence and for values that had a deeper grounding than mere taste or self-interest. What else can one say about Nietzsche's positive or constructive thought? For one thing, he doesn't completely jettison the concept of justice, but he radically redefines it. As he explains in Human, All Too Human, he sees justice as a balance among those with power, a settlement concerning the relative claims that those with power have on each other. In other words, justice for him assumes approximately equal strength among those who, in effect, bargain for their own interest. This is a radical reversal of the Judeo-Christian notion in which justice is most important when the parties are unequal in power. Nietzsche believes that this traditional notion of justice, as well as equality, compassion, humility, human dignity, love of neighbor, these are concepts whose falsity is laid bare once they've lost their grounding with the death of God. Equality, the notion which is the very foundation of justice as traditionally understood, is a particular target of Nietzsche's. In The Antichrist, he wrote, with characteristic color and verve, quote, Christianity holds that as immortal souls, everyone is on the same level as everyone else, because the salvation of each individual lays claim to an eternal significance. Christianity owes its victory to this miserable flattery of personal vanity. It is precisely the failures, the rebellion-prone, the badly developed, all the rejects and dejects of humanity that Christianity has won over by these means. In plain language, granting immortality to every Peter and Paul has been the most vicious attempt to assassinate noble humanity, end quote. As Brian Leiter has summed it up, quote, Nietzsche's hypothesis is that belief in God is essential to the egalitarianism that marks post-Enlightenment modernity. That is, the idea that every human is of equal moral significance or equal moral worth, such that it would be wrong to discount and ignore the interests of some human beings in favor of others. But there's another reason why Nietzsche is wrong. He's guilty of the naturalistic fallacy identified by the English philosopher G.E. Moore. That is, the fallacy that the good can be defined in terms solely of natural qualities or properties. The idea that what is, quote, natural is for that reason necessarily good, which was exactly Nietzsche's view, namely that humans ought not to have moral principles that restrain or push against anything that is natural. Thus, the greatest sin of Christians in Nietzsche's book is the monastic tradition, because it seeks to restrain natural human impulses. Parenthetically and ironically, it's interesting to note how monastic was Nietzsche's own style of life, including an extraordinary degree of self-control and self-discipline in the face of much pain, loneliness, and rejection. Nietzsche extolled the Dionysian, but there was more of the Apollonian in him than he would likely have wanted to admit. Back to Nietzsche's morality. Most of us would say, I think, it simply doesn't follow that because some people are extraordinarily talented with natural gifts beyond most of us, such as Beethoven, Goethe, Shakespeare, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, Nietzsche himself, that because there are such people, only they should be the beneficiaries of the moral system, and the rest of us, the herd, don't matter much. In the second essay of the Genealogy, Nietzsche muses on the process by which men are made ethically responsible, such as for the purpose of keeping promises. In contrast, he defines what he calls the sovereign individual, that's another synonym for the Übermensch, the sovereign individual as someone who's achieved an extraordinary degree of independent self-government, who, having freed himself from the morality of custom, is now autonomous, possessing and deserving to possess both power and freedom. At one point, he calls autonomy the very opposite of the ethical, by which he means the traditional ethical. Now, to be sure, and I want to be clear about this, it is possible to arrive at alternative, somewhat more sympathetic readings of Nietzsche's constructive philosophy, and I want to point to two such readings. Richard Schacht, whom I find to be one of the most illuminating guides to Nietzsche's thought, argues that, properly understood, Nietzsche does not really throw over all received moral norms in the so-called transvaluation of values. Speaking of promises, and despite what Nietzsche just said about the autonomous persons being freed from the morality of custom, Schacht points to Nietzsche's acknowledgement of the obligations of contract law based on the principle that promises should be honored. In that same second essay of the Genealogy, Nietzsche refers to humankind as having become, quote, an animal that may promise, close quote. He relates this to what he calls the long story of human evolution, in which there developed not only the sovereign individual, but the ability of this sovereign person to take on the privilege of responsibility to himself primarily, but not exclusively, and which involves the ability of such a one to, quote, give his word and to keep it in the form of a promise or a legal contract. Nietzsche even speaks at one point of, quote, giving laws to oneself, a surprising echo of Kant. Now, the extent of what Nietzsche means here is not entirely transparent and not entirely consistent. But surely this much can be said on Richard Schacht's reading. Nietzsche has retained some version of the traditional obligation to keep promises. So, perhaps the transvaluation of all values may be allowed to retain certain values from the old tradition, or at least this one. So that's one generous reading of Nietzsche's constructive moral thought. Pardon me. Second one, a little book on existentialism. Quote, Nietzsche was engaged in a process of tearing himself loose from his psychological religious roots at the very moment in history that Western man was doing likewise. Up to that time, man were of God. Now that all gods were dead, he was taking his first step into maturity. This, for Nietzsche, was the most momentous event in modern history. Could mankind meet this awful challenge? Yes, said Nietzsche. Man must live without any religious or metaphysical consolations. And if it was to become godless, he, Nietzsche, elected to be the prophet who would give the necessary example of courage. End quote. This reading, we should not look to Nietzsche for specific moral rules in the wake of the death of God. That sort of super rationalism would be utterly opposed to Nietzsche's free spirit. nor, despite his reverence for music, adopt the response of certain 19th century intellectuals such as Matthew Arnold or implicitly Schopenhauer, that culture with a capital C could replace religion and a basis for social cohesion. Rather, Barrett suggests, we should see something different in Nietzsche, namely a future in which the Übermensch, the talented and creative superior mortals, would live out and demonstrate a spirit of moral grandeur and excellence, taking them to the height of their capacities, sort of like the ancient Greeks. And finally, I want to make two quick last points before turning to Nietzsche's legacy. Although I haven't emphasized it, a certain spirituality. As mentioned earlier, he extolled lightness of spirit, considered himself and those like him as free spirits, he often used that phrase, and wrote about laughter and dancing, as Philippa Foot pointed out. His great hero was Goethe, who of spirit and sensuality into a harmonious self. He was a great fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson and kept his essays ready at hand. Now, this certainly didn't make Nietzsche a transcendentalist, but he undoubtedly felt some resonance with Emerson's emphasis on the role of solitary intuition and the almost divine inspiration of nature, thus connecting Nietzsche with a certain romanticism, as in other respects, social harmonism. Second, in these times we're living in, facing what seem to be more than the usual number of existential threats, the rethinking of values and the reconsideration of our norms and ways of looking at the world do have a certain timeliness. So we might be grateful to Nietzsche, at least, for the stimulus to do that. So, what is the legacy of Nietzsche and his proclamation of God's death? There are too many to name them all, but I'll focus on four of them. But before I do, I want to address one alleged and contested legacy, that of Hitler and the Nazis. There's no doubt that if Nietzsche is read fully and fairly, Semitism or Nazi ideology to him. But it's all elements of his thought could be and were selectively pressed into service by Hitler to support that ideology. Particularly Nietzsche's undeveloped concept of will to power, as I mentioned, his notion of the subversion of morals by the weak to cow the strong, his argument in genealogy, and Nietzsche's psychology consist of warring drives or conflicts. All this against the enormous shadow cast by social Darwinism over so many at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. It's an enormous topic about which much has been written. I simply note it to put it aside for my purposes, satisfied with the conclusion of most historians that Nietzsche cannot be blamed for this selective misuse of his thought. Now, the four genuine legacies. First is postmodernism, a broad umbrella term that includes, for example, deconstruction, post-structuralism, radical hermeneutics, some strands of which suggest, at least sometimes, that there are no such things as fact or objectivity, that truth is a delusion manipulated by those with power or with colonial ambitions, and that it's folly to distinguish between history and propaganda. Is faithful to Nietzsche's views is a different question. I think it is. I think they're not. But it is undeniably inspired by him. The risk this obviously portends is that in the absence of at least a broad consensus on values, including the value of truth after God's death, what fills the void is power, struggles for power and the will to power, with few or no ethical limitations or norms. Something of a neo-Hobbesian, agonistic political world. Sometimes it seems as if we're in that world right now. So that's one legacy. Second, and at the other extreme, is humanism, or secular humanism, reflecting Nietzsche's own optimism, denying the death of moral egalitarianism, or of compassion, or justice, or social conscience. Humanism may come with or without liberalism's traditional faith in progress, an idea which has taken something of a beating in the 20th and 21st centuries. Peter Singer celebrates the death of God, and believes it's possible to create, and that he's made such a beginning of morality after divine disappearance. He follows in the footsteps of Jeremy Bentham, as John Rawls follows in those of Kant, all of whom attempt to build ethical structures on the soil of Judeo-Christian values without the God who has traditionally formed the substrate of that soil. Sarah Bakewell's recent book, Humanly Possible, is an accessible guide to such thinking. A Secular Age by Charles Taylor is a masterful summary of its unfolding in the modern era. But as Brian Leiter and others have pointed out, Nietzsche would not necessarily approve, because humanism is not really a transvaluation of all values. Rather, he would say, humanist thinkers are simply voicing the repurposed remnants or hangovers of Christian values, which, after the death of God, have no grounding and no basis. Now, there's also a species of humanism called Christian humanism, which obviously is theistic and keeps God in the picture, but argues that nature and reason combined with revelation provide a solid bulwark for life's meaning and values. One thinks of Erasmus and Thomas More, or more recently, William Schweiker of the University of Chicago Divinity School, in his book, Religion and the Human Future, Essay on Theological Humanism. Third legacy, and in a direct line of descent from Nietzsche, as well as Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, is existentialism, represented by such later figures as Husserl, Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Camus. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is another example. Such existentialists felt alienated from God and from much of 20th century culture, especially in light of the destruction of the two world wars. Nonetheless, their quest was for some kind of meaning through an inner life where autonomous subjective feelings might serve as a bastion against an empty, uncaring, absurd universe. Such existentialists are not value nihilists. They argued for certain values, but the reference to the absurdity of existence suggests the difficulty of avoiding existential nihilism, a groping for a sense of meaning in life. There's also a modern tradition of existentialism known as Christian existentialism, denying God's death while radically redefining God, and built on St. Augustine, on Pascal, and on Kierkegaard, but also very much influenced by Nietzsche, as represented, for example, by the 20th century theologian Paul Tillich. Some Christian thinkers, particularly in the 1960s, went further, embracing Nietzsche's declaration and creating a body of thought called the Death of God theology, which once Time magazine, back when that was a thing. Of course, and this is especially important, there are portents or fears of the death of God, of profound doubt coexisting with tenacious faith throughout the Bible itself. Consider, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes, the story of Job, or many of the Psalms, including Psalm 22, containing the words uttered by Christ on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Fourth, and finally to conclude this partial list of legacies, there's Nietzsche's so-called last man, who appears in the prologue to Zarathustra. This is the non-philosophical, anti-philosophical, passive nihilist, a modern Epicurean who seeks no meaning in life other than family and friends and the pleasure provided by things available in an advanced Western economy, a good income, a successful career, the esteem of one's friends, leisure time, and mass entertainment. This is the man who finds escape in what Pascal calls those two sovereign anodynes, habit and diversion. Nietzsche is predictably scornful of such persons because they have no urge to strive for meaning, no restless desire for anything other than the comforts of daily life and contentment. Nietzsche's scorn is unsurprising, coming from one with a relentless search for meaning, but that disposition is not shared by everyone. Kierkegaard thought that ultimately such persons will think more deeply as they approach death. Maybe, but who is to say? Maybe the last man is the lucky man or the happy man, whose life is lived without the anxiety for meaning, which is characteristic of Nietzsche, the philosophically inclined, or of those whom Augustine describes as restless souls. And it was Nietzsche, after all, who told us that the systems of philosophers are merely forms of personal confession, that one's philosophical yearning is mostly a function of one's psychological disposition. I close with a final thought and a final question. The thought was expressed by the late Jonathan Sachs, formerly chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, who said this: "Morality matters more than we commonly acknowledge. It's all we have left to bind us into shared responsibility for the common good." End quote. Now, shared responsibility for the common good is not a phrase Nietzsche would have used, nor would he happily have received instruction from a Jewish rabbi any more than he would from a Christian priest. Yet the sentiment is not wholly at odds with Nietzsche's valuing of values, however much it radically departs from his ethical elitism. And for those of us who, whether we believe in God, dead or alive, believe that the fundamental values of the Judeo-Christian tradition are worth preserving, backed by those with much power but little regard for the victims of power, for us, the notion of the common good and of our shared responsibility for it retains not only much appeal, but indeed much urgency. The final question: are we better off that Nietzsche lived and wrote and that we read him? No and yes. No, in the sense that to some extent, he inspired exactly what he predicted, namely a long period of value nihilism, which risks the forfeiture of the search for truth and meaning and resigns from the effort to assimilate the values of the ethical tradition into the demands of stressful, modern, godless political life. Yes, we are better off in the perhaps than any other single modern thinker. Nietzsche identified and diagnosed our cultural sickness. And whether we're sick or well, and especially when we're sick, knowledge of our true condition is surely better than ignorance. What we do with that knowledge, or whether we're simply paralyzed by it, remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that very stimulating and talk. You covered a whole lot of ground. We have about 13 minutes left, which I say with some regret because we have enough questions from the chat to fill many multiples of that time. But I will put some of these questions to you in the time that remains. My apologies in advance to all those who asked questions where I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, and my apologies for mispronouncing some of the names, as I inevitably will do as I put these questions to you, Richard. So the first question I'm going to ask you comes from Joy.
No, I'm not hearing you if you're talking.
Let's see.
And the others can hear you?
I hope so. I'm unmuted and my microphone is on. Zoe, you want to?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think everybody
Okay, so
might be Richard's audio.
Richard, I'm going to keep talking to see if you're able to make a change and hear me at some point.
Okay, now I think
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
I have a bunch of questions. Here we go. The first question comes from Joy Schwabach. Why was it a madman who said God is dead and we have killed him? Why not a prophet? I assume this is for ironic effect that he is a madman to the crowd. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think Nietzsche saw man as quite similar, right? A prophet, if he or she is a genuine prophet, is usually perceived as a madman or a madwoman. So yes, I think you're right. I think it was ironic, and I think it was meant to say he's going to be perceived as a madman, and certainly that's the case here, because he's come too soon. People don't see it yet, but they will eventually. But thanks for the question.
Thank you, Richard. The next question comes from Oksana Rosen. What was the turning point for a child of a priest to state God is dead and then search for new moral values?
Well, I'm not sure there was a single turning point. He had lost his commitment to his liberty very early on from his reading. If there was a turning point, it was probably reading Schopenhauer, because he was very much impressed by Schopenhauer. Later on, he became a critic of Schopenhauer in many ways, but reading him, a second turning point was his very famous relationship with the composer, who am I thinking of? Who
Wagner?
wrote, pardon me?
Wagner?
Yeah, Wagner, Richard Wagner. Obviously, his first book was about Greek tragedy and was sort of modeled on the idea that Wagner would be able, through his music, the pre-Christian Germanic um, commitment to ideals that were quite similar to what the early Greeks uh, had in mind. Now, he later had a famous falling out with Wagner, although he always liked his music up to a point. Um, but he never had a falling out with the ancient Greeks. So I think if one had to identify Schopenhauer and his encounter with Wagner.
Suppose it's helpful for maintaining a relationship to have one party be long dead and gone. Thank you, Richard. So the next question comes from Marcy Fraser. The question is, why, according to Nietzsche, must Christian values be completely discarded?
Yeah, I raised that question myself. He never really addresses that. Why does he not? It's because he's not a systematic thinker. I mean, if you were to confront him, I think he would admit that it just shouldn't automatically follow that just because certain values have been underwritten by a God who's now dead, that those values couldn't represent, at least in part, the experience of humankind who found those values useful. This was my point about Feuerbach. And Feuerbach said those aren't really God's values; those are our values. We just projected them onto God. He never really addressed that. But the way he wrote and the way he spoke, he never felt compelled to answer questions like that. And certainly validly criticize him for not answering it. And I don't think he could really justify, if we had him here and could encounter him, I don't think he could really justify his assertion that just because God is dead, therefore everything represented by 2 millennia of Judeo-Christian values must be worthless. So I don't think that's defensible.
Thanks, Richard. The next question comes from Don Comfort. Where and how does the Hebrew Bible support slave or herd morality?
Well, the Hebrew Bible doesn't very much. I mean, you've got to read it in a particular way, as Nietzsche does. Probably his most famous book, The Genealogy of Morals, is the book that makes that claim, and he bases it very much on actually a very perceptive notion of resentment or ressentiment in French. And there's much, if you, so the argument that historical values came because oppressed people, slaves, got this great idea that the way that they could achieve power is to convince everybody that humility and powerlessness is a good thing, and that would permit them then to limit. And so you have this reversal of morality that he objected to very much. It meant that the weak and the outcasts were now setting the standards. That was his argument. As a historical matter, it's foolish. There's no evidence for that. On the other hand, if you back up a little bit, or an essay about the role of self-interest and resentment in creating or sustaining moral values, does have a point. And so I think that's the best way to read the genealogy and the best way to read his strained interpretation, both of history and of the Hebrew Bible. Point, as he often does, about human nature. His discussion of resentment was really pioneering. That and some other things as well were taken up later by Freud, but he really pioneered that. Actually, he said himself that the person who best, he acknowledged that Dostoevsky in his fiction best represents resentment. And of course, Nietzsche took it up as a philosophical principle.
As it happens, the next question I have lined up in the queue is a question about a connection between Nietzsche and Freud. So you have a kind of prophetic gift, Richard. The next question is from James Shaw. When I studied Nietzsche some years back, I was struck by the thought that Nietzsche is Freudian. Of course, the direction is the opposite. Freud was sort of a Nietzschean, yes. What do you think of the connection between the two?
Yeah. And they're both worth reading. There is a story that I think is believed to be true. I think, which is that Freud at one point, of course, he read Nietzsche, because everybody did at that time, that Freud at some point stopped reading Nietzsche because it would interfere with Freud's own original ideas, and he didn't want his own original working out of psychoanalysis and his own analysis of human nature to be interfered with by Nietzsche, which, I don't know if it's certainly plausible because yes, they certainly did think along the same lines. Now you might have thought Freud might have approached it differently and said, all right, I'm going to read Nietzsche and see if I can improve on him or something. In any event, there's a great deal of overlap between the thought of the two, which Freud did acknowledge to some extent.
Thank you, Richard. The next question comes from Jennifer Lind. Did Nietzsche believe there is no free will?
No, Nietzsche believed that we did have free will. As far as I know, I don't think he subscribed to determinism. He certainly wouldn't have subscribed to any version of Calvinism, for example, which then that particular version of predetermination or predestination. I think he would be able to write the way he does about the creation of values or about free spirits or joyful spirits. So I think it's quite clear that he did believe that we exercise free will.
Thank you, Richard. The next question comes from Jeffrey Sarles. Nietzsche's writings strike me as an attempt to lay a philosophical grounding for elitism. Do you disagree?
Well, they certainly do. His, as I said, his positive, constructive thought is all about elitism. The talented, the superior mortals, the Übermensch. He doesn't really defend that. Ken James, who's another Nietzsche scholar whom I find very helpful, he's at University of London. Ken James says, he doesn't really give any reason why the rest of us should sign on. Nietzsche, what Nietzsche seems to be doing is expressing his own vision of what is most preserving, what is most worth preserving in Western culture. And that's what is represented by the highest artists and creative people, such as the ones he mentioned and the ones I mentioned, but including scientific people as well, although he put great weight on creativity and artistic creativity, but he also respected scientists, Galileo, Einstein came later, but yeah, I think it's definitely an elitism that we find hard to swallow without some kind of justification. And you can imagine, I guess, some attempt to justify that, but he doesn't really try to. That elitism by him, it's certainly put forward. It's clearly what he meant to say. It's what he thought, but he doesn't really defend it. And it seems hard to defend without his, on the face of it. Because as Ken James says, why should the rest of us think that, you certainly can agree with him that we want to preserve and we want to uphold the creative geniuses who enrich all of our lives. No problem with that. But shouldn't morality consist of more than that?
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to try, if we can manage it, to ask you three more questions. The first one is a question about content, and the others are about matters of reference. So Jerry Ree says, you brought up a strong sense of repeal and replace. Do you think replacing nihilism must be simple? That is, must the replacement be simple in order for us to remember Nietzsche's prescription?
I'm sorry, the replacement of nihilism? I don't quite understand the question. Could you read it again?
Do you think replacing nihilism must be simple? That is, must the replacement be simple in order for us to remember Nietzsche's prescription?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, I don't think. I think it's a question of whether we reject or accept nihilism. He rejected it in the sense that I mentioned, both ethically and existentially. He didn't accept metaphysical grounds for anything, of course, but he thought there were adequate natural grounds to create values and sufficient natural reasons to live a worthwhile life, indeed, to have it be recurring forever and ever. So I guess to the extent I understand it, that's about all I can say about it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, which is there any way, this is from John V., is there any way we can get a copy of your paper and references? Do you recommend any books and resources for further study?
Yeah, of course. And I have a selected, but here's what I would suggest. Send me an email, rjh1@uchicago.edu, rjh1@uchicago.edu, and I'll be happy to send you both my little one-page selected bibliography of people I would suggest you read, And I'd be happy to send you a text of the lecture. Sure.
Thanks very much, Richard. All right, at this point, we only have one order of business left. We have taken in basic program First Friday lectures to doing our best imitation of what we would do in an auditorium if we were all together. I'm going to press the Ask All to Unmute button, at which point I invite you all to unmute yourselves and thank Richard with some applause. So here we go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank
Great.
you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard.
Have a wonderful
All right.
Friday, everyone.
All right. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Gracias.
Great job in spite of your throat problems.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.